Hey there AOS fans, welcome back to episode 2 of How to Play 40k. Now if you haven't watched the first episode, I would suggest you go back and do so because it will just run over a few of the basics that you might need to know if you've never played this game before. We are of course coming at this from a completely new perspective, so we're assuming that no current knowledge is known about this game, and I'm going to try and avoid referencing the old versions of this game during this demo. So we are now going to cover the movement phase. Now before I do that, I just want to quickly go over what GW term as a battle round. Now Warhammer 40,000 is played using a series of battle rounds, and during each battle round both players have a turn. Normally player 1 will go first, then player 2, player 1 will then have their second battle round, player 2 their second battle round, and so on. And each battle round is broken up into 6 phases, and those phases are movement, psychic, shooting, charging, fighting and morale. I'm going to go into each one of those in turn in these next episodes. So the first one we now go on to is the movement phase. Now at the start of your movement phase, you can run through each unit, vehicle, model in your army, and you can move it up to and including the number of inches they have on their movement characteristic. No model can be moved more than their movement characteristic, and no model can normally move more than once during their movement phase. There are instances that will go against that, but they are special cases and we'll cover those as and when we need to. Now to move a unit, you just say which unit you want to move, you look up their movement characteristic, and in this case we have our fire dragons here who we know can move 7 inches, and you just literally move them up to or including that movement. So this guy moves 7 inches, and remember we're using our principle of moving front to front or back to back. This guy's then going to only move up 5 inches to come right behind him. Now you don't have to move your full 7, you can move up to that 7. This guy here is going to move 5 inches as well. And these guys form a bit of a snake line or a conga line as it's sometimes called, and they're just going to move a few inches. Now, every model must maintain coherency, so at the end of their movement phase, they have to make sure that they are within 2 inches of each other. And as you can see here, all of these models are within 2 inches of each other. So that unit is okay. I can now move on to the next unit I want to move, and the next, as normal. Now there are some restrictions to movement. Models cannot come within 1 inch of an enemy model during their move. So as an example, I've got my fire dragons here and this predator. Now the models can move up to 6 or 7 inches. Now I cannot go past this predator because to go past it I would come within 1 inch of this predator. So I can only move up to 1 inch of that model, and I have to stay further than that away. None of these models are closer than 1 inch of this model, and they can't come any closer in the movement phase. So you can really use that to your advantage. If you want to try and block your opponent's advance, you can move units in the way and you can spread them out in front so that they can't get past. Now there are a few exceptions to this, and one of them being flying. So let's assume my turn starts and I've got my swooping hawks here. Now let's say that swooping hawks can move 12 inches and they have an ability called fly. Any model that has fly on its data sheet can move across models or terrain as if they weren't there. So these guys can move way over top of this predator, and they can literally move as if the predator wasn't even there. But they do have to make sure that at the end of their movement, they cannot stop within 1 inch of that enemy model. But otherwise, they pretty much move however they like. So it may not be a predator in the way, it might be a piece of scenery. Now whilst my fire dragons can all move 7 inches, they just can't move straight through the scenery. They have to move around it. You can move along and up, so this guy can move 5 along and 2 inches up to the top here, but you cannot move through the scenery. So if this guy, for example, started here at the beginning of his turn, he can't move like this straight through. He has to go around, and as you can see, if you start to have to move around things, your movement gets shortened by quite a bit. But flying units don't have to worry about that because they can ignore intervening models and terrain. So this guy can again move easily 9 inches and bounce straight across, as can this guy and that guy. So you can already see a benefit of flying models. They can move much faster and much more accurately where you want them to be. Some flying models also have a minimum movement. Now this means that they may have to move at least 20 inches or at least 30 inches. They'll also have a maximum move, which is the most they can move, but they'll have a minimum move, and they have to at least move that much. If they cannot move that much without coming within 1 inch of an enemy model at the end of their move, or without going off the board, then that model's either crashed or stalled or been forced to abandon the battle. Now, another thing that all units can do in the game is they can advance. What advance does is it will stop them from shooting, and we will cover that later, but it enables them to move faster than normal. Now, in the case of most troops, when you advance, you roll a d6 and you add that to your movement. So we know that d6 is a 6-sided dice, and all we have to do is roll this and add it to our movement of 7. 3. So I can move 7 plus 3, which is 10. These guys can now move 10 inches instead of 7 inches. So they suddenly get a much bigger burst of speed. And again, they don't have to move that full distance. They just have to move up to the 7 inches. Ooh. Like so. Everything can advance in this game unless specifically stated otherwise. So tanks, troops, monsters, anything can advance and add d6 to their movement. Now, one of the last things in the movement phase is falling back. When a unit starts its movement within 1 inch of an enemy, they either remain stationary and cannot move at all, or they have to fall back. If you choose to fall back, the unit must end its movement more than an inch away from all enemy units. If a unit falls back, and it cannot advance, and it cannot charge, and we'll come on to charging later on. A unit that falls back cannot shoot, unless of course that unit has fly. Let's say we've got 2 units here. We've got our swooping hawks and we've got our fire dragons. Now, whilst this guy here and this guy here and this guy and several of these guys aren't within an inch of this sentinel, one man in that unit from both units is within 1 inch. So they cannot move unless they want to fall back. Now, if a unit falls back, it just moves its normal distance up to its movement value away. So I can move these guys up to 7 inches away, but as normal, I don't have to move them the full 7. I can move them all a little bit like that. But they have to be more than 1 inch away from all enemy models. And again, my swooping hawks, they can move 12, so they can very swiftly leg it far away from the sentinel. Now, you do have to make sure you end up more than 1 inch away from the enemy. So these guys can move 7 inches away, but the trouble with that is that pretty much puts them right on top of the tank, and they can't do that, so they have to fall back in this direction. So they can move over this way, they can fall back this direction over here. As you can see, I don't have to move very many models in that situation, but I do have to move them enough to ensure they're all at least 1 inch away from the sentinel, from the tank, from all enemy models. Not just the one that they were within 1 inch to start with. They cannot move within 1 inch of another enemy unit when they fall back. Again, flying models can fly over the top of enemy units, but they are not allowed to end their movement within 1 inch. One last item that we will cover later on that comes within the movement phase, so we'll touch on it briefly here, is reinforcements. Now, a lot of units can enter the game via reinforcements, and there's many ways they can do it. They might teleport in, they might fly in like our swooping hawks here, or they might burrow up from the ground like a lot of other models might do. In those situations, you'll be told how you can deploy them and when you can deploy them. Usually it's at the end of their movement phase, and the assumption is that they use all of their movement up when they land. So if a model deep strikes in, for example, or teleports in at the end of the movement phase, and let's say this guy does it, he has to land a certain distance away, and that is the end of his movement. He now can't advance or he can't move. He has to stay where he is, and he gets to no more movements in this phase. So that's the end of the movement summary. Hopefully that gives you a very quick understanding of all the various rules of movement in that phase. But if there are any questions at all, do obviously post them in the comments below, and I'll be doing my best to try and answer them as soon as they pop up. Next episode, we'll be covering the next phase, which is the psychic phase.